The U.S. government deeply regrets this incident. A full investigation will be conducted, but it is our judgment that based on the information currently available, the local commanders had sufficient reasons to believe their units were in jeopardy, and they fired in self-defense. The sequence of events commenced when Vincennes' helicopter was fired upon by Iranian surface units at 10:10 a.m. local Gulf time. For correlation, that was 2:10 a.m. Eastern Daylight Time, approximately 40 minutes before the air action. Subsequently, the Vincennes identified the Iranian firing units and closed to engage. The Iranian gunboats turned toward Vincennes at high speed and were engaged at 10:42 with gunfire from the cruiser and the frigate Albert B. Montgomery. While so involved, the Vincennes detected an aircraft over Iran at about 10:47 a.m., again local time. This aircraft headed toward the Vincennes and commenced closing at high speed. Vincennes immediately began assessing this new threat. The suspect aircraft was outside the prescribed commercial air corridor. More importantly, the aircraft headed directly for Vincennes on a constant bearing at high speed, approximately 450 knots. A warning was sent on both military and civilian distress frequencies beginning at 10:49 a.m. This procedure was repeated several times, but the aircraft neither answered nor changed its course. There were electronic indications on Vincennes that led it to believe that the aircraft was an F-14. There have been a number of F-14 flights in the area over the last few days. Given the threatening flight profile and the decreasing range, the aircraft was declared hostile at 10:51 a.m. local. At 10:54 a.m., when the aircraft was about 9 miles away, Vincennes fired 2 standard surface-to-air missiles, at least one of which hit at an approximate range of 6 miles. Due to the limited visibility, the aircraft was not visually sighted until the missile impacted. The total context in which
ships operate.
The U.S. government emphasized from the outset that committing military units to the Persian Gulf mission would involve risks and uncertainties. This conclusion has been reinforced by several incidents. For example, Bridgeton mining, the Stark tragedy, and the Samuel B. Roberts mining. A decision was made early in the commitment to give our commanders sufficient latitude to protect their people and equipment when hostile intent was manifested. They do not have to be shot at before responding. Throughout our involvement in the Persian Gulf, the Iranian government has repeatedly threatened and fired upon U.S. forces. In September 1987, as a result of the attack on the USS Stark and other incidents, the United States issued a notice to airmen, colloquially known as a NOTAM, which advised all aircraft in the Persian Gulf region that U.S. Navy ships were taking additional precautions and of the need to identify themselves and to state their intentions. Additionally, they were advised that failure to respond to requests for identification and intentions or to warnings and operating in a threatening manner could place the aircraft at risk by U.S. defensive measures. As to the recent environment, we have alerted our forces of indications that Iranian units might attempt to carry out attacks against our forces over the July 4th holiday period. We are still in the process of reconciling and collating all the data. An official investigation of the incident will be conducted by Rear Admiral William N. Fogarty, United States Navy of the U.S. Central Command. That concludes my statement.
Admiral, has there been contact with the Iranian government, and if not, is any plan?
There has not been direct contact, no. I think we'll be awaiting the results of the SAR effort and any other indications.
Have any orders been issued to change the mode of our operation?
No,
Admiral, the Aegis cruiser is supposed to be one of the most sophisticated in the fleet in determining threats. How is it that it apparently misidentified this aircraft?
I'm a little confused by your statement. It is one of the most sophisticated ships we have, and certainly the improvements made in the Aegis weapon system have greatly amplified our capability. And I'm talking about the number of targets that we can track, the ranges that we can detect a target, the altitudes, and our ability to detect and classify emanations from an aircraft. But it has not solved all our problems, and it does not defy the laws of physics. And one of the most difficult problems is from a radar blip, particularly from a head-on target, to identify the type of aircraft and so forth. I repeat for you that the people in the command center and the people operating the radar had about 4 minutes from the time they picked this target up until it was declared hostile. That alone is a severe constraint.
But what led them to believe that it was an F-14?
Some other electronic information which is classified and I'm not willing to discuss.
Was the airliner squawking as it should be with its IFF? Two, did the airliner have the right to be where it was? And what was your judgment? Was the skipper acting under the rules of engagement, or was he a little bit impetuous here?
Let me do it in reverse order, if I could, please, George. It is my judgment, on the information that is available to us, that the commanding officer conducted himself with circumspection, and considering the information that was available to him, followed his authorities and acted with good judgment and at a very trying period of time and under very trying circumstances. Let me repeat that not only was he following this aircraft and was he concerned about it, he was engaged on the surface with Iranian units at the time. The aircraft was not in the air corridor that would normally be in, but the air corridor is a limited amount of airspace, and he was outside of that. Whether that is a factor, I don't know at this point. And what was your first question?
The last one was whether his IFF was squawking, and whether it would have happened if the old rules of engagement were still in force.
The old rules of engagement?
If you had changed the rules in September, would you have held his fire, the skipper?
Certainly rules of engagement would not have been as specific in the authorities that granted him. I don't know whether he would have or not under the old rules. You're asking me about IFF. We did have some electronic emanations, but I really can't say any more than that.
Well, he didn't identify himself as a commercial? Or?
No, he did not. Now, I should stress, of course, in that regard, that we warned him on the civilian air distress net 3 times in these few minutes and 4 times on the military air distress net.
English saying, we have you in...
Yes, we received no answers, nor did he very coarse or did he indicate in his conduct in any way that he had received our communication.
He was squawking something, but not the recognizable, I am an airliner.
Well, it led us to believe that it was a military aircraft.
How common is it for a civilian aircraft to be outside of its normal air corridors in that part of the world?
I don't know that I can answer that question. It seems to me that 2 things are pretty clear. First of all, flying in that kind of constrained environment, that you would be very careful, particularly given the warnings and the NOTAMs we have issued. And secondly, I don't understand the responsibility of a country that, while it is attacking other ships and making a war zone out of a certain area of the ocean, and then goes ahead and flies a commercial airliner over that part of the ocean at the time that attacks and hostilities are underway.
Is there anything else unusual in terms of speed or altitude of this aircraft other than that it did not respond and that they were out of the normal flight corridor?
As I said at the conclusion of my statement, not all the data is in, but we do have indications that the people on the ship were led to believe from the flow of information, and we're reconstructing this now, that the aircraft was not only on steady bearing and closing, but that it had gone up in altitude and was increasing or decreasing in altitude as it neared the ship.
So there we have it. Admiral William Crowe, chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, confirming that U.S. naval forces shot down an Iranian civilian airliner this morning over the Gulf. With the loss, he didn't give the number, but Iran claims there were 298 people aboard. Lark McCarthy is standing by at the White House. Lark, of course, the White House has been absolutely silent on this. I take it that is a strategy whereby they wish to keep this in the area of a military engagement and not elevate it to the area of a diplomatic incident.
That's correct, Sam. I think they are trying to downplay what is clearly a disaster. Now, the White House has just issued a very limited statement calling this a proper defensive action, but we have yet to hear from the president himself. Mr. Reagan is at Camp David. He's not scheduled to return until tomorrow, and of course we'll be looking to see if he does indeed come back early and whether there are any high-level meetings here today.
Well, I suppose, Lark, there's a difference between this incident and the one in 1983 when the president did come back from his ranch in California. There, the Soviet Union and the United States were, to use the old cliche, eyeball to eyeball, in a sense, over the shooting down of 007. This is not an incident that involves directly the Soviets.
That's correct, Sam. And another difference, quite frankly, is that at that time the United States was able to express moral outrage at some action by the Soviet Union. Well, this time it's the United States that has done something that is quite questionable, shooting down an airliner containing civilians. So I think they want to measure very carefully what they say and how they respond. And so far, the only word is that the White House is calling this a proper defensive action.
Thank you, Lark. So they're leaving it to the Pentagon. Let's go back to Admiral Crowe now, the chairman of the Joint Chiefs, as he continues to answer questions on this incident.
Territorial waters, they are conducting a search in there. We are not in there. We've gone pretty close to try and follow events, what they are doing. But no, we are not in the vicinity of the wreckage.
You might have said last week that the M14s operating out of Bandar Abbas were usually operated in tandem with M4. Can you tell us whether there were any other running aircraft of any description?
There was an F-4 up later. Whether it had been up all the time or earlier, we're not able to determine.
Was there a way to avoid these incidents?
Well, a few minutes. I don't know exactly. But it did not come out. It didn't go feet wet, and it didn't play a part in this.
Mr. Chairman, you might want to point out on the map here where the wreckage is.
This is sort of a simplistic chart, try to keep it simple. The incident this morning when it all started was in this area. This is the reproduction of Vincennes. Our helicopter was fired on in this vicinity, and about in this same area, from this direction, somewhere in like this, coming dead in, the aircraft was impacted about here. We're running into reporting the wreckage in this vicinity, and that is right southwest or rather southeast of Keesham Island, and we're still in the vicinity there trying to follow those events. This is the commercial air route, and the attack this afternoon was in this area.
What distance is it off the commercial air corridor, Admiral, when it was shot? How far out the corridor was it?
Well, it's somewhere we believe in the neighborhood of 4 to 5 miles. Again, that is subject to correction as our data refine.
You may be implying by the abnormal behavior of this aircraft that it's not inconceivable that the pilots were trying to draw the fire of these missiles.
I did not mean to imply that.
Admiral, the people are going to ask, okay, this happened, the Persian Gulf was a million accidents waiting to happen. Have you made any recommendations as to how to minimize the risk of this happening again? And what do we do from here?
We, of course, are constantly surveying and reviewing. Not only the circumstances under which we operate, but also the rules of engagement. We do not discuss the rules in detail, but this obviously will put increased emphasis on such a review. It will also be a facet of the formal investigation. But I emphasize that as a matter of course, every single day and every single incident in the Gulf is reviewed, and if it suggests that we should do our operating pattern should be different, we try and follow that, learn it, and profit from it. If we see something as our study of this and our analysis of this that suggests that we can make it more safe and still protect ourselves, we'll change it. Let me repeat, the number one obligation of the commanding officer of a ship or units are the protection of his own people. We deeply regret the loss of life here, but that commanding officer had a very heavy obligation to protect his ships, his people. We've made that clear throughout the Persian Gulf mission, and we have acted on it accordingly, and we believe it is right and proper.
Admiral, what details do you have what happened after the missile hit the aircraft? Where did it hit the aircraft?
I don't know that we could determine that, but we do have some vague. Incidentally, the visibility in the Gulf at the time was about 2 to 5 miles. That, of course, depending on where you are, and variations may be mixed. But we do have some eyewitness reports that saw the vague shape of the aircraft when the missile hit. And it looked like it had disintegrated.
Admiral, have we done anything to join any search or help to rescue possible survivors?
We had some other reports, which is not too abnormal in this kind of situation, that yes, they thought there was wreckage here, wreckage there. These were outside of Iranian territorial waters. We checked every one of those with helicopters and ships. We have attempted to run down and to assist in any way we can without infringing Iranian territorial waters.
Was it raining or fog? You say poor visibility.
Just haze.
Admiral, have you determined what started the first incident, why the helicopter was fired on, how that all started?
It's a little vague, but there were 2 merchant ships in the area and probably a total of somewhere 13 to 15 small boats. And our ships were coming back through the strait, and when they closed, now I don't have this in great detail, but when they closed, some of those small boats, bogenhammers, left the area and presumably returned at high speed to Bandar Abbas. Several stayed in the area. We got no requests from the merchant ships, so when we passed, it looked like that our presence was deterring them. Later, to get a better picture, we put a helicopter in the area, and when it went over toward those boats, they fired on it. That's when the Vincennes turned back toward, withdrew his helicopter, and...
What did they fire with? Was it missiles or...?
No, it was gunfire.
Did the airliner make any kind of radio communication after the Vincennes?
No. No.
Nothing after it was hit?
Was only
Either
one,
before or after.
was only one missile fired, or were there more?
2 were fired.
Do we know in that sequence which one it was?
No, we do not.
Has there been any pattern of Iranian F-14s using airliners in the area as shadow to conduct controls or anything like that?
We have not detected that as a pattern. Now, the F-14s in the area is a relatively new development. We have had those, of course, in the Central Gulf for some time, mainly operating out of Bushehr, our airports in the central part of Iran. But in the last few weeks, and particularly the last few days, we have had some F-14s in the Southern Gulf, and I believe yesterday, Halsey?
Yes, sir, yesterday and 3 days ago.
Yesterday we had an F-15 in the neighborhood of the Halsey, but they communicated, and he went around the Halsey at safe distance and responded to our request. But this is an unusual development. And
We're going to take a couple more questions and wrap up.
I'm sorry?
Was this an accident waiting to happen?
You could, in a sense, of course, characterize all combat operations as an accident waiting to happen. We have said from the very outset of our involvement there that when you're using force and when you're putting combat operations on to support your policy, and it is a policy that is resisted and not agreed to by another party who is likewise willing to do things, you're running risks. We have never pretended otherwise. We have been very successful with our using our strength to keep down these kinds of accidents and incidents. I think that if we have contacted airliners before, we have had them respond, they have varied course. That policy has been very successful. And again, I repeat, if a country is going to wage combat operations in a certain area and then send a commercial airline in the area during that, of course it's an accident waiting to happen. And if airliners do not pay attention to these instructions and the guidance that we have put out and the warnings we've put out, then that poses problems. We do deeply regret the loss of life, though.
You implied that not only was this out of the air corridor and not responding to your signals, but that you detected that it was losing altitude and gaining speed and flying over an area where combat activity was occurring. In addition to all those irregularities concerning this aircraft, have you been able to determine whether it took off on schedule as a normal commercial flight? Are there any other irregularities?
We're trying to detect that, or determine that right now. But I would like to emphasize your point for a moment. F-14, on corridors, out of corridors, the important points here are commanding officer has a responsibility to protect his people, his unit. He is engaged already in a surface action. He has a minimum amount of time. It is logical to conclude that while he is firing and they are approaching him and an aircraft lifts off from Iran, goes toward him, steady course, high speed, increasing altitude, will not vary, will not contact him. It's a more than logical conclusion that he may very well be in jeopardy.
Admiral, on the origination of the flight, did it come from, I don't know what city, I missed that.
We believe Bandar Abbas.
It did lift off. That's a military base, isn't it?
No, it's joint, civil and military.
Bob,
Just let me finish with that. You tracked that plane on takeoff?
We don't know, but maybe we did.
Admiral,
George, Bob's been trying to ask a question here for a long time.
Is this the first time an Iranian commercial airliner has acted in this way?
He had a name change.
I don't have a specific example of where it has before. We have multi-nation airliners in the Gulf. In general, our policy has been responded to. Occasionally, we have an airliner that ignores it. But usually, they're at very high altitude. The reason that these accidents are avoided, namely, is that civilian airliners fly at very high altitudes, and particularly because of that area. This one did not.
Let's do Bob and then wrap up with George, please.
This captain's responsibility notwithstanding, an F-14 being an American-made plane, shouldn't it be one of the easier aircraft to identify, especially stacking its information radiated against a four-engine commercial airliner?
It depends on, of course, what it does. It depends on how much information you have on it. It depends on the attitude which it's flying. It depends on the altitude. It depends on the atmospheric conditions. It depends on how much time you got to process the data. And unfortunately, this has been one of the major difficulties in the Persian Gulf from the outset. We're fighting in a lake. And when flights come feet wet out of Iran, very few seconds, no matter what.
The comparison is going to be made with, this was a case of U.S. mistaken identity, and a commercial airliner was shot down. The Soviet Union was a case of mistaken identity in Korea in 2007. What is the difference, in your view, between this shoot down and that one?
I think they're two very fundamental differences. There are probably a whole host of them with more thought, but the fundamental differences are, of course, that it was not a war zone. There was not combat in progress. There was not combat there normally. And secondly, the KAL-007 was not warned in any way, form, or fashion. Nor was, as far as I can tell or determine, was any attempt made to warn it. And it was at very high altitude, and even after the completion of the incident, I don't think any claim was made that it was there to bomb or destroy. It was accused of being an intelligence gatherer. That was certainly not the case today.
Thank you very much, Admiral.
Admiral William Crowe, Chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, confirming at the Pentagon in a briefing this afternoon that the United States Navy did, in fact, by mistake, shoot down an Iranian jetliner over the Strait of Hormuz earlier today during a naval engagement between the United States and Iranian forces. Let's go back to the White House and Lark McCarthy. Lark, the President did issue a statement earlier today, which you summarized. Give us a little bit more sense of what he said.
Yes, he issued a statement from Camp David, Sam, and in that statement, and I'm quoting now, he says, "I am saddened to report that it appears in a proper defensive action by the USS Vincennes this morning in the Persian Gulf, an Iranian airliner was shot down over the Strait of Hormuz. The President says this is a terrible human tragedy. Our sympathy and condolences go out to the passengers, crew, and to their families." And the President goes on to say that the only U.S. interest in the Persian Gulf is peace, and this reinforces the need to achieve that goal with all possible speed.
All right, Lark, thank you very much. I think, of course, the White House was very quick to issue that statement compared to the Soviet Union in 1983, which took a long time to even confirm that it had shot down an airliner, and then did so grudgingly and without much of a statement of regret, at least not initially. So to recap, what happened this morning in the Persian Gulf at the Strait of Hormuz was there was a naval engagement between U.S. and Iranian forces, which the Pentagon said began when Iranians fired at a U.S. helicopter. During that engagement, an Iranian airliner flying on a route from Bandar Abbas, headed toward Dubai, came over the Strait of Hormuz. The Aegis cruiser Vincennes, believing that it was an F-14, a hostile jet fighter, fired 2 missiles at the plane, one of which hit, and Admiral Crowe says the indications were the plane was destroyed immediately. Now, of course, there are not parallels, as well as some parallels, between this and the 1983-007 incident. But whether it is understandable or not that U.S. forces were engaged properly in the Persian Gulf, this incident is sure to give the United States a black eye in many places in the world. Critics of our Persian Gulf policy, both at home and abroad, will point to it as an example of what happens when the United States goes in there with military power. Admiral Crowe did not assert that the U.S. was there to close the airspace. In fact, the United States is there to make certain that their international shipping is allowed in the Gulf. So the fact that the airliner was not on a prescribed course does not mean that it did not have the right to fly over the Gulf, which contributed, of course, to this tragic mistake. We'll have the latest on this from here in the United States and World Reaction on World News Sunday over many of these stations later today. I'm Sam Donaldson from Washington. Good day from Washington.
This special report came to you from ABC News in Washington. We now resume our regular program schedule.
It won't be for the last time.